about marketing. So I'm going to ask you up front, what does that mean? What comes to your mind? Just throw words at me. What comes to your mind when I say marketing?
Selling. Selling.
Selling. Okay.
Research.
Research.
Getting your message out.
Getting the message out.
Relationship.
Desire.
Understanding the needs of the people you're trying to reach.
Understanding. I'm going to use some shortcuts here. So, understanding needs, and I heard desire.
Defining what it is you're selling.
Yes, defining the product. I'm going to say whatever that is.
Branding.
Branding.
Target audience.
Target audience.
I'd like to challenge the word selling.
Okay. I'm going to.
It's not actually selling, it's the psychology behind the selling.
Okay.
Demographics. Loyalty.
Okay.
Education. Dedication.
Dedication.
on there?
Dedication.
Credibility.
Credibility. Yes. That.
Alignment of resources.
We need resources, and they need to be aligned. Multimedia. I kind of think. Anybody else? Anything else comes to mind?
Competition.
Yes. Should have that down there. Okay. Question, and anybody can answer this, not just the person who said education. What's the difference between education and marketing, if there is a difference in your minds?
Well, education, I think, is broader in the sense that it makes your potential customer or client aware of the need for the product or service. So if you make them aware of the need, they may decide, you know what, this is quite a good idea.
Okay.
So there's no selling involved as such.
So it's almost seeding the ground for.
It's the planting of the field.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let me try and define to you what we talk about as marketing. I think it's many of these things, and it's a little bit more and a little bit less sometimes. But for the purposes of this workshop, when we talk about marketing, we are talking about a series of activities that you do to make your target audience take a particular action. Okay? And that action could be a number of different things. In some cases, marketing is the action is to buy something. In some cases, it might be to do something on their land. In some cases, it might be to give you money, to donate money to your organization. In some cases, it might be to give you their land or to sell the land to you. So there's a variety of actions that you can have. But to our minds, and for the purposes of this workshop, all that we talk about, we are not talking about communication that doesn't have some kind of a behavioral goal in mind. We're assuming that if you're going out of your way to talk to someone, to engage someone, you are doing it with something in mind with regard to what you want them to do. Okay? In many ways, that is a fundamental difference between what people typically think of as education and what people think of as marketing. Because education can just be informing someone about a need or about a situation, right? Without necessarily pushing them to take any action. Okay? And what we are arguing over here, and we hope to persuade you, is that especially when you have limited resources, almost everything that you do, any kind of outreach that you do, anything that you invest in doing outreach, should be leading to some action on the part of the landowner that you're reaching. Okay? Even if it's several steps ahead, even if you're like, well, they won't do anything now, but if I talk to them 5 times, they will do something. It doesn't have to be an action immediate. They won't necessarily do it the first time you talk to them. But you need to know what your goal is and what that action is on the part of the landowner. Okay? So that's why we call it marketing. Does anybody in this room have any negative ideas about marketing? Most of what I heard was sort of positive. I see, you guys have a sense of it needs credibility, it needs a brand, it needs loyalty, it needs resources. Right? So most of what's up here is neutral and positive. And I see a hand up there. Yes?
Yeah, it's essentially value neutral.
Okay. Say more. What?
Well, that's all about, as you were saying, prompting people to do things, but there's nothing in there about whether what they're doing is good or bad particularly.
Yes. That's very, very important because a lot of people think of marketing itself as a negative thing. It seems manipulative, I've heard, maybe not from in this room, but several other workshops that we've done. People have this idea of it's mildly sleazy, it's manipulative. The point is it's a tool. It is a value neutral tool. It's a set of skills and expertise which can be put to good use or to bad use. Okay? And if you're convinced that your causes are worthwhile, you should feel confident and certainly not sleazy about putting marketing tools to use in service of that cause. Okay? Someone else had a hand up, I saw one. Yes.
Well, I covered it, but I guess sometimes you think of marketing as convincing people to take an action or buy something that they don't really need, but you're in that sense it's negative.
I think smart marketing is not negative, and let me tell you what I mean. One of the examples that I like to use in this context is about car salesmen who have a bad rap. Everybody kind of has this, they're the stereotypical, marketer that either tries to upsell you things you don't need or bothers you too much. It's sort of, that's the idea people have of car salesmen. Now, oftentimes when I talk about car salesmen in particular, people will say, yep, they're a pain in the ass. Sorry, can I say? So, oftentimes that's what people will say. But I often ask them, so what about the person who sold you your car? And oftentimes what they'll say is, well, that guy really understood what I needed. And he was able to give me a great deal, and he was or she was able to give me a great deal, and exactly the features that I want, and some that I didn't even know I wanted, but I really love them now that I have them. Now that guy was a good marketer. Because that is really about figuring out your audience's needs and finding a deal or a product, finding what you can offer them that actually meets their needs. So in my mind, when you do smart marketing, you're actually working closely with the audience's needs and maybe even upping them a little bit in a way that actually feels good. So when you ask for, I work with a lot of fundraisers since we have a firm that specializes in working with nonprofits, and sometimes we ally with fundraisers and work with them. And most of them say that when they talk to boards about fundraising, when boards get it working right, they find that when they don't feel hesitant about making the ask for money, because they find that giving the money, they work the relationship to a point where giving the money makes a person more grateful and happier at the end of it. So it's almost like the donor is then thanking the person, I'm so glad you gave me the opportunity to do this. Right? As opposed to you feeling that you drew something from them. Okay? So that's how I want you to think about it, that you have to identify, find an audience that has a certain need and find an offer, make an offer that matches that need, as opposed to them feeling that you either pull a fast one on them or something that is going to actually make them grateful years down the line, rather than regretting what they did years down the line.
So is part of the job then identifying a need? Because I think sometimes we're talking to people who haven't sorted out issues like needs versus desires, particularly in regard to land and land conservation.
Yeah. So a lot of what we talk about today is how do you find the right need? How do you tap into the right motivation? And how do you, in your target audience, bring the right motivations to the fore at the right times?
Well, I mean, it's complicated though, because the desire is not to do things, right? And often with us, I think the same thing goes with fundraising. The desire is not to spend your money on a conservation organization where you don't actually get an obvious, unless we give them a cup or something like that, right? So, you have to, I think the key thing is to be able to distinguish a need from a desire so that they can, overcome the desire not to be involved or not to do something or not to part with money or
there's
tie up their
resistance.
land.
Yeah.
And
It's to
because
overcome
they
the
see the need is greater than that.
Yeah, and more importantly, they have to be able to see that the value that they're going to get is bigger than the resistance that they encounter. So, any other thoughts on marketing? Okay. So then, let's talk about. If any of you look at the workshop, the phrase that at the website, the phrase that we use for a lot of what we're doing is targeted marketing. So, what does that add to this?
When you're targeting an audience, your focus is actually outside of the organization. Your focus is actually on the audience, on the customer, on their needs, on their motivations.
Okay.
And it gets you away from looking at the organization internally, and it also helps you frame your questions.
So, the way we talk about this is exactly that. There's an audience focus, so the audience becomes really important in this. It's also, we call it targeted because what we're saying is you are targeting a particular set of people to do a particular behavior. Okay? So marketing is about getting someone to do something. It's a more general term. This is just calling into sharp focus the fact that you have to be very, very specific about whom you are talking to and what behaviors you want them to do. Okay? Now, targeted marketing has its roots. Frankly, I think it's a phrase we created, so I'm reluctant to talk about it as a discipline, but basically what we're talking about is what used to be called social marketing. And the reason that we're not using the term social marketing is because now that word is used mostly to refer to social media marketing. And that's not what this is about. So we don't want to confuse you folks, so we don't use the word social marketing. This is a discipline that has its roots in sort of mostly development programs, international development programs that were sort of in the 60s and 70s. So what happened was that after the war years, the US became one of the major donors and got involved in the Cold War, so they were trying to do a lot of development assistance in different parts of the world. And they found that they were having very little success selling, quote unquote, even free stuff. Okay? So even simple things like contraceptives or oral rehydration solution or vaccinations, all the Peace Corps and USAID and all these folks were going out there and saying, come to our clinics, it's a free clinic, you can get vaccinations, but nobody would come. Okay? And that set them thinking. They're like, back home, and think of what's happening back home, right? At that time, it's the rise of the consumer culture in the US. People are buying stuff that they don't even need. Okay? You all have seen Mad Men. Some of you have actually lived through the times, the others have seen Mad Men, so you kind of know this. It was the time of, sort of that growth of advertising and marketing and being able to convince people that they need stuff and have that tap into those aspirational motives very well, right? So these folks, the international development folks are thinking, well, back home in the US, we can sell them washing machines when they don't really need washing machines, even people who don't need them, or didn't know they needed them until we began selling them, right? And here, this is something as simple, we're trying to sell like life-saving things, vaccinations or oral rehydration solutions, and we're giving it away for free and people are not taking it. What is wrong? What are we doing wrong? What are we not doing that those guys are doing? Or what are we doing that we shouldn't be doing? Okay? So that really got people thinking. And what they came up with was exactly this focus on the target audience. That marketers, product marketers, spend a lot of time trying to understand their target audience. They spend a lot of time trying to figure out why people are going to do this behavior, what their mindset is when they're doing this behavior. Like, I'll take the example of a washing machine, right? The person who buys the washing machine, what is the decision-making process? Who's buying this? Who can buy it? What are they going to be thinking of? How are they going to use this? What can we do in that washing machine to make it attractive to the people who are going to be using it? Okay. The other thing that they're thinking about a lot, which typically development folks didn't think about, was the competition. You know, what other washing machines can they buy? But also, what other ways can they be spending that disposable income if not on a washing machine? Right? What is the competition for this product that we do? Okay? And then most importantly was the idea of segmentation, which we will spend a lot of time on today. They realized that all the people who buy washing machines don't buy it for the same reason. Okay? So there are different kinds of people out there, and they will do the same behavior for different reasons. Okay? And the marketers are very, very smart about targeting their messages to those different kinds of people. Okay? They don't try to do the same. They don't try the same message or the same product to get to everybody. They're very good about tapping segments of the market and intensively tapping segments of the market. So with all these things in mind, the development folks then developed a discipline that they call social marketing, and they called it social marketing not because the others are antisocial or because it's not, but to sort of bring the focus back on the people, right? But more importantly to say, well, this is marketing for social good or for social causes. And also very often, instead of selling a product, they were trying to sell a particular behavior. So some of these are very easy to sell, like campaigns to prevent sudden infant death syndrome by not sleeping your baby on the tummy. That's a relatively simple behavior to sell. Okay? Some of them were more complex, like exercising regularly or wearing your seatbelts. Right? So all these behaviors that have become part of, I guess, most cultures now, took a long time for people to catch on to, because there were behavior changes and everything from some discomfort. The first time you put a child in a car seat, the child is uncomfortable and wails and would rather not be in a car seat. So it involves discomfort. It involves, to some extent, habit, because people are used to doing things a certain way and they may not even remember to do it every time. Like when you first began wearing seatbelts, you didn't always remember to clip in, right? So all these things, to understand what are the actual barriers along the way and how can we overcome those. And sometimes it's just repetition. Sometimes it is, making cars that remind you to do things, or it's reminders, it's repetition, it's emphasizing things, making it important enough, getting other influences. There's a whole lot of other things to do, right? But the main thing over here that people learn is really to work with the audience needs rather than imposing your mental model of what the problem is on the audience. Okay? Also understanding that what you think is the most urgent problem in the world isn't what the audience sees as the most urgent problem in the world. Okay?
Can you talk just a little bit more about that, what you just said about working with the audience? Just flesh that idea out just a little bit more, and how that relates to what we're here for in the target marketing piece, please.
Or how it relates to seatbelts. Okay, so you could argue everybody has a will to live. Nobody wants to die in a car accident. Okay, so at the very big level over here, you're working with an audience need. If you're trying to promote seatbelts, right? So why do people not wear seatbelts? Or why did they not wear? I guess not everybody wears them, but why do people not wear them? It's because it's mildly uncomfortable and because they may not remember to do it. Yeah?
Well, there were some mistaken notions that a seatbelt will be trapped in the car and will be able to escape, so it may
Yeah.
increase your risk of dying rather than reduce it.
Exactly. Right? So there's misbelief, right? There's just habit. And then there's obviously some people who are just like rebels. They're not going to wear it no matter what. Just because they want to be different, they won't wear it. Okay? So there's a number of these reasons. Now think about why people do wear seatbelts. When you wear a seatbelt, do you always think, this is going to save my life and that's why I'm going to put it on? How many people do that? Okay? So why do you wear a seatbelt?
Car goes ding, ding, ding.
That's a good reason to wear a seatbelt.
I'm tired of paying $150
Oh, fine.
each for not having it.
Yes. Okay. What other reasons do you wear a seatbelt for?
You might feel guilty if something actually happens.
You'd feel guilty if something actually happened, because then you'd say it was my own fault for doing this and I could have prevented it. Yes.
Example for your kids.
You set an example for your kids.
It's a habit now.
It's a habit now. Or your wife is going to tell you, or if a friend sees you, in the car, they're going to be like, dude, you don't wear a seatbelt? Right? So there's a normative factor here. You're seen as sort of an odd person if you don't wear one.
Somebody also said it's the law.
Yeah, you get fined. It's the law, right? So that is an example of how
It works.
it works. Yes, it works. It does save your life, and you hear of that occasionally when someone's in a car accident. You hear about that it saved their life because they were wearing a seatbelt. Okay?
And there are lots of statistics supporting that it works. Cheap that people can use that reinforces that.
Exactly.
How did you transform?
That's a very, very important point, that before people began doing this, you didn't actually have the evidence really. I mean, you knew there was test evidence, but you really didn't have those statistics in place, and yet now you do. Okay, so it's something that builds on itself. It's a norm that builds on itself and becomes more and more powerful once it gets into that cycle. Okay? Now, what's important here is that the need, as you see, as initially was seen as sort of a public health and safety need, saving lives, is now irrelevant to actual seatbelt use. Okay? So this is, the important thing is, as you were talking about the needs and the demands and things, the problem or the need as you see it is not the same thing as the reason people will do something. Okay? So you have to, when you're doing this, when we work on our workshops today, we really focus on the audience need, right? But understanding that the need that we are tapping into is not the most obvious one. The need may be just a social need over here. It may be just a normative kind of thing. What's important to these people is to look like responsible citizens, and that's why you push seatbelt use, not necessarily because it's going to save their lives. Okay? So which audience need you tap into may not be the obvious one. It may not be the most direct one. Okay? So keep that in mind when we go forward, that the message and the need are completely different things, or could be completely different things. Okay? Especially for complex behaviors. Especially for behaviors that exact some cost from the target audience, either in terms of time or effort or changing the habits or money. You have to give people additional needs and incentives that may be more urgent and more powerful than the real need, which is either a conservation need or whether it's saving lives or whatever. Okay? So I want to talk a little bit about what we call, what in the discipline social marketing is called the 5 Ps of marketing. Are you all familiar with that? Okay. So this is important because it helps you take a broader view of marketing. Okay? So here's what the 5 Ps are, and so marketers product marketers tend to use these 4 Ps a lot. And the 5th one, depending on which writer you're reading, sometimes it's partnerships and sometimes it's policy change, which becomes, the 5th one becomes more relevant only in the context of social marketing.
Can you just say what they are?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. Okay. So the first one is product. Okay, and this is actually the behavior that you're trying to sell. Okay, this is the actual offer that you're making someone. It might be get a management plan for your land. It might be get a conservation easement on your land. It might be, plant this to invite more birds. So that's the actual behavior, and there are some positives that the actual behavior brings. It's going to bring more birds to your land, or it's going to preserve the land for generations. Okay, that's sort of the inherent value that that behavior carries. So when we say product, it's looking at what is the behavior in question and what are the benefits that the behavior carries. Okay? So similar, an analogy would be a washing machine, and the inherent benefit of that washing machine is it washes their clothes. Okay? So this is the bare basic thing over there. Then there's a price. Yeah? And marketers obviously spend a lot of time putting features into their products that make them more attractive, so that to increase these benefits, these perceived benefits. Okay? The most important thing about this is that these are perceived benefits. Okay? What is not important, if someone did ever want to wash their clothes, the washing machines, you say, this washes their clothes really well, and they're like, well, I wear dirty clothes, I don't need to wash clothes, right? So it has, the audience has to see this as a benefit. It doesn't matter what you think is a benefit. Okay? You have to focus on what the audience sees as a potential benefit for the behavior you're asking them to do. Okay? So it's, everything we talk about is from the audience's perspective. Price. Again, what is the cost? Now, obviously, there's often for many things there's a financial price, right? But there's always a cost in terms of time, in terms of just sheer attention, energy, mind time, mental space. Okay? And then there are other costs. How on land, for example, like oftentimes it'll mean, oh, my land might look ugly for a while. It may not look as pretty as it does. Or my view may be blocked for a while. Or if I plant this, it will bring the stuff, some attractive things in, but it may also bring some unattractive things in. So there's always other behavioral costs that you have to account for. You can't focus completely on the positives and ignore the costs that the landowner sees. And some of these you have to actually actively work to overcome. So sometimes it's just a place and time kind of cost. I would love to plant trees, but I don't know where to get seedlings. Or have to drive so far to get them, I'm never going to do it. Right? So maybe you can work with them to mitigate some of those costs. And some of them, you just have to have the positives so strong that it outweighs the costs in people's minds. And we'll talk a little bit about how to balance that. So then there's place. And place is, it's a little more intangible. In marketing terms, it's very easy to think about place. It's where you place the product. It's shelf space in Walmart, and what other products it's placed next to. Is it placed at eye level? And there's a lot of time that marketers spend trying to secure the most attractive place for their products. Okay? In social marketing terms, this becomes a little bit more intangible, but very, very important. And that is, what is the context in which your behavior offer is made? Okay? What is the context in which they encounter information? Okay? Let me explain this by a couple of simple things. There's a lot of research out there. It's easier for me to illustrate it by giving you a few different examples. That's why I explain this. So there's a lot of research out there that says if you make 2 offers to someone, okay, let's say you ask someone for $10,000 and they say no, and the next week you ask them for $500, they're more likely to give you the $500 than they would if you had just asked them for $500. Okay? So here is a situation in which the context, that first context, set, it's the frame in which they are seeing your second offer, and it's making a difference to how they're responding to that offer. Okay? Another way of thinking about this is that if, let's say you're talking about sidewalks, okay, you're trying to build support for creating sidewalks on neighborhood roads. There's a cost to this because it's going to detract from the sort of the rural look of the town. Let's say that's what people are opposed to. Okay. Now, if you make this, and the hypothetical being set up here is that you are trying to promote sidewalk, so you can do this in a number of situations. If people are in their homes and they're admiring the view, and you go talk to them and say, I think we should build sidewalks, they're likely to say, look at this view, it's going to ruin this view. Okay? Let's say you go to a PTA meeting and you say your children have to walk to school every day, we need to build sidewalks. The same people are going to be better predisposed to vote yes on it right then. Okay, so the context, the hat, you wear hats, you wear a lot of different hats. The hat that you're wearing at that moment makes a big difference to how you view an offer. So setting the context up for this, right, is actually very important. I mean, there's a whole lot of social science research on this. How questions are worded on a survey changes how people respond. Which questions follow and precede a particular question changes how people respond to it. Okay? So really trying to understand what is the best possible frame of mind. And this is obviously true for marketing offers, because if you are looking for something, you are much more likely to pay attention to a flyer that says, this is available, right? If you're not looking for it, you throw it away, it's junk. Okay. So how do you tap into people who are already looking for something, so they're already well predisposed to your work? And so, some of you mentioned that there's limited resources, right? So how do you bring the most qualified prospects in the first place? How do you use your time and energy to reach people who are already predisposed or are in the right frame of mind, rather than squandering your resources on people who are never going to do it anyway, or who you have to work harder for? Okay, so that's one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is, how do you create the context where people will be more predisposed? How do you create the right place and the right frame for your work? Yes.
Okay, so a follow-up question from some of the discussion that's already happened. So let's say you have birdings, and you have a target audience that likes birds, and we talked about. Are you saying that is sort of the initial place, the context, that helps set the stage for moving those people to thinking about, well, I do have land that I can start to begin to protect this habitat? And is there any metrics, or is there results that actually show, maybe get into this later, show that setting that context from speaking, and I always say, from where the person is at?
Yeah.
Sort of will help move them in a direction of thinking about things that they haven't thought about before.
I don't know of any metrics specific to birding. There are lots of metrics.
Context
Yeah,
like that.
there's lots of evidence to show that if a person takes a small action that is suited to what they want to do, they can be on the road to take a larger action. But if you start with a larger action, they're likely not to do it. So certainly that sets the context. What also changes with that is if they do birding trips for whatever reason. Maybe someone took them. Yeah. So a friend said, I like birding, would you like to go with me? And this is great. And they had a good time, and maybe there was nice coffee, and they met some nice people. They do that 3 times, they begin to think of it, because our self-concept changes, right? You begin to think of yourself as a bird lover. You may not have been a bird lover, maybe that's not the initial reason you went there, but now that's part of your self-concept. I think I'm a bird lover. What would a bird lover do? They would protect habitat, right? So that is another way in which the frame starts working for you. That person builds their hat, a bird lover hat, and they start wearing it. They acquire that identity. So it's a very, very good thing to get people to do small actions, because then they start, a really good example here is recycling, right? A lot of people are not necessarily environmentally minded, but they do recycling because, everybody does it, and the bins are there, it's easy, and you kind of get in the habit of doing it. And there is evidence to show that once people start doing some small actions like that, they begin to seek out more information, for example, on environmental causes. They begin to think of themselves as environmentalists, not everybody, but some people do, and then they will do more and more on that count. So then the recycling becomes more and more complicated. You have to start sorting. If you had to start out like that, if nobody ever recycled and they said, well, you have to wash everything, you have to put it aside and everything has to be done just so, people would not start like that. Right? That's way too much effort. Right? It started out as a very simple behavior, and then you begin to think of yourself, yeah, I think this is something I do, and you kind of take pride in doing it right now because everybody does it. It's something to be proud of, and you're all environmentalists, and so you do it. And then you can layer on demands at that point because people have already developed that identity. Okay, so there's a lot to be said for small steps. Okay. So that's for place. Promotion. Promotion is the reason that you give, the message, the spoken, written, verbal, non-verbal cues that you give people to motivate them to take action at that point. Okay? And going back to the conversation that we had earlier about seat belts, the reason you give someone to do something is not necessarily the need or the problem reason or the real reason. Right? So the promotion can be different than the actual benefit that that behavior brings. Going back to the washing machine example, the real benefit is this washing machine really washes well for you or washes your clothes for you. The reason you buy it, maybe, is because what will the next door neighbors think? They have it, and don't you want to keep up with your next door neighbors? You must have the latest washing machine too. Okay? So it may have nothing to do with, let's say I'm talking about a Miele washer, dishwasher. It may have nothing to do with how well it washes dishes, but a lot of people have it because all the high-end kitchens I've been to have Miele washers, right? So the promotion is different than the actual benefits. It has to support. I mean, if it washed really badly, at some point the high-end kitchens will stop having it, right? But it doesn't, the benefits, they have to be related, but they're not the same thing. Okay? And then you have this fifth P, which is partnership and policy. Or policy, just like I said, different people, depending on the context, think of it differently. Partnerships are very, very important, both for getting your message out, right? But also for creating a brand. Who supports you is very, very important, both what your brand is. And sometimes nonprofits make the mistake of looking for as many partners as they can find, without regard to the fact that some of those partners may actually be undermining their brand. So you actually have to be careful about who you partner with.
I'm sorry, I have another question. I've also heard that
Good
you listed
apologize.
five listed there. I've also heard that there's a sixth, and there may be 7 and 8. But one that I've liked in the past is also persuasiveness, because it really addresses your credibility, where you talked about partnerships, but it also talks about that you've actually built a trustworthiness and an ethicalness as a place to stand in integrating all these together, so that there's a strong persuasiveness that you build, yes, and is reflected in your brand.
Yeah, so this is one of what you're talking about, sort of the outgrowth from social marketing and going to relationship marketing at some point, and that's really what you're talking about. How do you establish both a relationship with individuals, but also sort of a brand relationship between the community and the organization that then affects all of these things.
Could you explain what you meant by having a bad partner that would undermine you?
So let me give you an example, completely hypothetical. Let's just say that you are positioning your organization. When you position yourself as an organization with a brand with certain attributes, right? It means you have to give up on some other attributes. So let's just say you position yourself as a very religious an ethical organization, religious in the sense of an environmental organization that is very people-oriented. So rather than wildlife, it's about people. It's about people's enjoyment of the land, for example. And it's about the community's enjoyment of the land. And you work with your local churches, you work with the local community centers, you work with the local Boy Scouts. It's all about taking people to nature. Okay? That's the brand image that you've created. We're very people-friendly and we're trying to connect people to nature. Okay? And let's say you partner with an organization that is more, in whatever way, more exclusionary, and if that's a word, but it's about keeping people, preserving nature and limiting access to nature, because that's, a lot of people feel that way about environmentalism, that you want to set aside and prevent use of the national parks and limit the number of people who are getting national parks, right? So that sends a mixed message out there, like who are you really? And you come through as either wishy-washy or insincere in your brand. So you really have to find people, even within an environmental spectrum, you have to find people who are natural partners with regard to the philosophy that you are portraying. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So actually, a real concrete example of that is some of the very large national NGOs are partnering with big corporations like Walmart, Dow Chemical. My guess is they're doing that with a lot of thought behind what they're doing, and in some cases, people are leaving them, right? But they've seemed to make a deliberate decision about the ultimate benefit of that. But that's the kind of thing. If you do that without any real careful thought behind it, then you might lose people that you hoped you wouldn't lose, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess, yeah, that's a really, really good example. And I guess the point they're making over there is that we are the kind of people we want support from, the members that we're trying to attract, are the people who feel that corporations and environmentalists can work together. So you're making a very strong statement over there. And you're saying, it can be a win-win. And if you are the kind of environmentalist that believes there is no such a thing as a win-win with regard to corporations and the environment, then you're not going to participate and support that organization. Okay? And then the other one is policy. That becomes really, really important, because social marketing efforts and policy efforts build on each other. There's almost a cyclical, it's a virtuous cycle that they can get into. So an example being seatbelt use. I'll go back to that since we've been talking about that. If you had tried to pass laws way back when seatbelts were first introduced that everybody needs to wear a seatbelt, nobody would have been able to do that. There would just not be enough political will to pass those laws, either at the local level or the national level. Okay? So then you start to work with social norms. You try and create the norm, you try and encourage people to start using it, you start building up the statistics, people start doing it as a voluntary behavior. And then there comes a sort of a tipping point when you can actually legislate that. There's enough support, there's enough momentum behind the idea that then you can rely on legislation, and then that feeds back. The laggards who weren't doing it voluntarily now have to do it. Okay? So the two things actually build on each other, and policy can be a very important adjunct to a social marketing effort, and then it can actually benefit from that social marketing effort once the legislation is passed. So for most...
Going back to that same time, we're talking about seatbelts. Before we're going to convince the public to put on their seatbelts, we had to have seatbelts.
Yes.
Which was the first policy thing, was to convince the manufacturers to put seatbelts in their cars.
Thank you.
Which
That's
didn't
a
happen,
really
I believe,
important
until
point.
57. I think 57 Ford, I think, was the first ones to have
Yeah.
it, I
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah.
No, that was first. That was a policy decision.
Exactly.
Whether or not that came from government, I don't honestly know
Yeah.
where it actually
Yeah,
came
and
from.
so it starts sort of as a
Somebody
voluntary.
convinced them to do it.
Someone did it as a voluntary thing, and then they were able to bring enough people on board that then the legislative process kind of kicks into play, and that brings in more people on board. So whatever change you're trying to do, try and see what the policy angle is on this, whether there's room to play with that a little bit.
Building on his point, you get a large enough power behind it. In this case, it was the insurance companies.
Yeah.
That they're paying out insurance fees to people who are dying in car accidents, to avoid paying that money out, let's get seatbelts in
Yeah.
and enlist the aid that way.
Yeah, and that goes back to your partnership. It's sort of like, the public health people and the insurance companies are not natural partners. They often, and yet for this particular policy change, it made sense to partner in that way to make it happen.
Or tax on cigarettes, the way that ended
Exactly,
up,
that's
and
right.
now we're having this huge debate on tax on sugary drinks.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, that could end up being,
Yeah,
I think right now,
And
we're
that-
thinking about that in terms of where we were back in 1964. And that whole issue,
Yeah.
you know.
that's
is
a really
coming to
good
the-
example because
Yeah.
that's one issue that's at that, it's not
great.
clear whether it's
People
at the
don't
tipping
see
point
the-
yet or not, you don't know
the
where it's going to go.
financial value, but if
Yeah.
they see the toll on the healthcare system and everything, it might.
Yeah, yes.
I can add to that as far as land use and flooding and FEMA and insurance rates. You know, what we do is best management practices when people are developing properties. And homeowners, a lot of times would just, and developers wouldn't care, they would just cut, clear, plant, whatever. And now they're thinking, and I know our conservation board reviews every application and we recommend plantings that will help erosion, and flooding and the value of trees. So I think it's really important that we come in from an environmental perspective.
And
It's really best management practices really
Yeah.
fits right in there.
yes, you speak very closely to a workshop we did in, I think it was in Iowa, where there was a lot about promoting best management practices, and they had been promoting it for all the environmental reasons and to lots of farmers in Iowa. And the whole campaign shifted here to prevent flooding, which farmers do care about. They don't really care that much about endangered species and what the landscape is going to look like 100 years from now, but they're very concerned about immediate flooding. So pushing it, and that again speaks to how the promotion or the reason you give people is very different than what the overall benefit is, or maybe it's just one of the overall benefits, but you amplify that because that's more important to your target audience. So, yes, yeah.
Just being involved in policy issues, you had mentioned before open space acquisition funding, using our taxpayer dollars. That in itself is getting, land trust getting on the bandwagon to support those initiatives, change the outlook, which changes tax in municipal tax policy. The other thing is, for example, protection of watersheds, and critical resources in the face of climate change. Really talking about aquifer overlay zones. We've been talking about that with our conservation board. So between the partnerships and the policy, being obviously, and many of us are in this room, part of those discussions.
Yes.
Yeah, I think building on your question, isn't the big issue here essentially that this project is all about climate resilient landscapes? And there is, I think, a fair share, at least in our town, of people who don't even believe that there's a climate issue. So we're at that sort of stage.
Yeah, I think
There's some
Mary's going
mismatch.
to, I'll hold that comment, and Mary's going to talk about maybe the time prospect. That might be a relevant way to talk about that.
But just one concept is in the way of policy, if you can get a municipality to look at increasing the tax benefit for a conservation easement, you create another tool.
Another incentive.
Another incentive to then go back to the landowner, and flooding could be the reason that.
Yeah, exactly. So there are lots of policy tools, even, like I said, there are minor changes to policies and that can be often done at the local level that can make huge differences in terms of what your target audience sees as benefits. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff that we talked about over here. I'm going to give you a sort of a simple visual way to think about this. So think of this is your landowner. We'll make her a she because we talked too much about he. Okay. That's not a mustache, that's a smile, sorry. Okay, so that's the landowner, and this is the persuasion slide. You basically want her to do something, okay? Now the first thing here is that all slides, I'm pushing this analogy here, all slides have to be aligned with gravity. If this slide was going there, you couldn't get a landowner to walk it, right? So gravity is your basic landowner needs. Your audience needs. Okay? So if you're trying to sell something that is antithetical to your audience's needs and values, it's not going to happen. Okay? And this goes to sort of product design. Think of behaviors, think of things that they can do and will see some value in. Okay? You can then play with that. You can accentuate certain things. You can give ancillary reasons. You can provide incentives. But the more you work with gravity, the easier it's going to be to make this happen. Okay? And sometimes that means changing your ask. Maybe stepping, as we talked a little bit about, making a smaller ask and then leading to a bigger one later, because then the alignment becomes greater. Okay? So this is the motivations that you provide. Okay? So it's the sort of the incentives, the reasons, the how persuasive you are. It's the persuasiveness, as someone mentioned. Okay? Now think about this, the slope of the slide, right, is your promotion of persuasion, how persuasive you can be. Okay. Now if the slide is, if this is your slide, right, it's really aligned with gravity, it's naturally easy to make it a very steep slide and, people can get down it very easily. Okay? If it's not quite aligned to gravity, it becomes a lot harder to do this. A lot harder to be persuasive. No matter how good a job you do, gravity matters. Okay? The other thing that matters very much is the friction. Okay? All slides have friction. And friction are the costs or the barriers to doing that behavior, the resistance to doing that behavior. Okay? So once again, if your slide is very steep and very aligned with gravity and the positives are really strong, people will care less about the barriers. The friction becomes less important to a very steep slide. Okay? If it's a slide like that's kind of like very different, far from gravity, then any little bit of friction matters a lot more. Okay? So you have to put yourself into the target audience's shoes, and we will do that later this afternoon, and say, we do this thing called pain and gain. So what are the points of pain? What are the sources of friction for your audience, right? And what is the potential gain? How well is this aligned? So they're only going to do this thing when the positives that they see from their perspective outweigh the pain of doing this behavior. Okay? Otherwise, they're going to get somewhere stuck along the slide. They're not going to make it to the bottom. Okay? So this is actually a really, really valuable way to think about, if it's a very simple behavior you're asking them to do and there's virtually no friction, then you don't need to provide a very strong motivation. If it's something that is a huge decision from their perspective, not from yours, then you do need to up the ante, provide extra incentives to make it happen. Okay? Going back to that sudden infant death syndrome, right? It was a very simple behavior for people to do, is to put their kids on the backs instead of the stomachs. And the potential gain was really, really big, right? But you didn't have to convince people a whole lot. You didn't have to say what exactly the statistics are, Whereas for something like vaccination, which is a little bit more of a pain and has a little bit more cost associated with it in terms of, potentially some kids not feeling well for a while and so on, right? There's so much more controversy about, well, how many people does it actually help? Does this really help me? And if I take a flu vaccine of a certain shot, of a certain strain, does it really prevent against other things? People question it a lot more, right? Because it's something that has a lot more cost, so it takes a lot more to be persuaded. Whereas for something very, very simple, it takes very little to be persuaded. Someone just says casually to you, you know what? I read something somewhere that your child can be safer if you, put them on their back instead of their stomach. And you're like, yeah, that's not a big deal, I can do that. Okay? So that cost-benefit analysis is very, very important for you to do from your audience's perspective. Any questions? Is it making sense? No? Yes? I like it when people nod, and I know you can all say yes, and you know, but just nod to let me know, or just shake and I'll figure it out.
Why can't you put this in the 5 Ps?
It's a different way, it's a pictorial way of thinking about the 5 Ps. It's just sort of condensing all that information.
I have to learn 2 things.
If you can learn either one, you don't have to learn both. Okay. All right. So the other thing that's very important here is the nudge. Okay? Someone might be right there. That's a beautiful slide. They're like, yeah, I think I want to get on this slide. But as you know, there are always more things that you want to do than you can do. Okay? So people usually need a little bit of a nudge to push them, even when they're all ready to do what you want them to do. Even if they're all predisposed to do, they are like, yes, this is a great idea, I really want to do this. Right? But that doesn't mean they're going to do it. Why? Because you know from your own lives, there are so many things you want to do. Okay? There's never enough time for them, and there's never the right time for them. Okay? So one of the things we're going to push you to do is to think about that nudge. What can you do to make people do this now? There are several ways marketers do this. Can you think of some actually? Think of the last time when you kept wanting to do something, maybe it was to buy a car, and then something happened that made you do it. What are some of the things that made you do things that you have been thinking or putting off for a while?
Special deal ends today.
Yes. Exactly. Do it now, and you get a...
You crashed your other car.
Yes. You had to do it. There was no choice. And this is actually, both of those things happen for environmental causes. So always when there's, if we do a lot of workshops where the foresters are trying to enroll people in stewardship programs, and it gets to that end of the thing, there's only, they go and they talk to people and they're like, the money is running out in the stewardship program. If you want to do this, you better do this now or else you can't do it. And then people kind of start signing up. Or what you said, there's some kind of a storm and lots of forests are ruined and they're like, well, what can I do now to make sure this doesn't happen again? So that's a really good teachable moment at that time to get people in. Yes.
I heard something funny on NPR. People might have heard the survey in their fundraiser right now. And I guess it was shifting the message in such a way that it really kind of hit me. And I thought, I'm going to give some money. It was basically, they did a funny skit on, I think it was on Mary Rock. He said, he called up on the air like a Verizon. It was a phone service. He said, I'd like 9 free phone accounts and I'll pay for one. That was like the 1 out of the 9 that pay for public television, public radio. They're getting these services. It just was a shift in perspective that was enough.
Yeah. Sometimes, yes. Just saying the same thing in a very different way can touch the chord that otherwise, yeah.
Threat, and I'm thinking particularly of political threat. Just an example that came to mind was back when James Watt became Secretary of the Interior, and all of a sudden the Sierra Club got a lot more money.
Yeah.
Because of the threat of him in office at that time.
Yeah. The threats are a really good nudge.
Somewhat related, property tax time. For vacant landowners, you don't want to pay this next round of property tax, do you?
Yeah. So it's when you're timing, as you said, some of these things are timing. But yes, sorry.
I think it's timing and it's opportunity. If we, just for a second, because we're in this situation, we become the landowner, the land trust are trying to do these outreach efforts, and the nudge becomes this golden opportunity to acquire a piece of property that is integral to what our plans are. That's enough of a nudge for us as an organization to say we really need to have the preparation in place to be able to take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah. Sometimes what membership organizations will do is, if you notice that they will have an event that you want to go to, and they will say, well, if you come to the event, it's like, maybe it's a lunch or something with a speaker you want to go to, and they'll say, well, it's $30 to attend the lunch, and if you throw in $5 more, you get membership free for a year now. So that's a nudge. You probably may or may not have become a member, and maybe you kind of thought it was a good thing. It's not something you mind, but it gets them in gets people in, and then a lot of people, once they see what the membership benefits are, encourages trial, and then they might stay on as a member for the next year too. So that's that little nudge that you can give people. Okay? So there's several ways of doing this nudge thing, and some of it is timing, some of this is extra incentives, some of this is piggybacking onto something that's already happening in the community that may be putting people in the right frame of mind. It's accentuating threats that may be on the ground. So what can you do that when someone says, yes, it's a good idea, how do you then make them move to action? And the one thing that moves people to action, the one thing, nothing else does, is emotion. Okay? Logic does not move people to action. Logic predisposes them to take action. It determines what action they will take, but people act because there's a certain emotion that you tap into. And you have to identify that. What is the emotion I'm going to tap into? Okay, that's going to translate that good intention into action.
The SPCA ads is very good at that.
Yes. Yes. The SPCA is very good. A lot of these, the organizations, I don't know how many of you do that, but the organizations that ask you to sponsor a child,
Yeah.
right? Most of the money is not going directly to the child. It's going to general development efforts in that area. But putting that face of a child on it makes a huge difference. That's your nudge. That's that emotional tug that makes the difference. Okay. Any other questions about this?
Just to tie it back into H2H, at the last meeting we talked about ambassadors. I wonder if an ambassador is someone who's kind of a local leader or role model. You know, they're doing X or Y. I should be doing that too. So
Yes.
sort of like peer pressure.
And that's a very important motivation. Ambassadors are very, very useful, both because people want to emulate them, and also because what they say carries more weight and believability. Okay? So think about an environmental message. Let's say a message that says, our forests are at risk and we need to act to save them. Okay? And you hear that message, and not you guys, but let's say an ordinary person who's not already engaged in these issues, hears that message from two people. One is an environmental activist, and the other one is the head of a local chamber of commerce and one who's always generally pushing businesses. Okay? It has more credibility. They will believe that message more from the businessman because they feel like, okay, this is not what he normally says. There must be some good reason for him to be saying this. As opposed to the environmental activist, well, yeah, that's what he says all the time anyway. Right? So the sources matter a lot, where the message is coming from. And that goes back to partnerships, it goes back to the credibility, the brand building. So you really have to think very carefully about who's going to carry your message and who can add weight to your message. And who can bring the right gravitas, it's not the right word, but the right credibility, the right influenceability, the right persuasiveness to your message.
Is there kind of a notion for the first, like the very first step in engagement? Because I mean, I could just turn off the radio, for example, when I'm here, and I don't want to hear it. See, that's it. I'm not going to hear it. So I guess the question is that very first. Yeah.
You're talking about something that is actually at the root of why we think targeted marketing is important in the first place. So thank you for giving me that opening. It was always important. It is even more important now because more and more we are so cluttered. The media environment is so cluttered. On any given day, you see so many different things, and you hear so many different people telling you to do or buy or do so many different things. It's hard. If I asked you, I think the stats are something like an ordinary person is exposed to, in the US, a regular person is exposed to something between 200 and 500 grams in a given day. Okay? Most of them you don't even see. I mean, if I asked you how many of you noticed what the billboards were or the signs were on the way over, you probably don't know. You don't even see those things, right? So you see things in two circumstances. I mean, apart from the fact that if you're really passing that every single day and you kind of over time. One is just repetition, right? You see it over and over again, so at some point it'll register. But the other two reasons that you see things are A, one, if you're looking for something, okay? So if you're looking to buy a house, you're going to see all the realtor signs, which you otherwise wouldn't have noticed, okay? And then the second reason you see something is when it is seen as immediately speaking to you. You see something that says, that either appeals to your sense of humor, or it speaks to your values. So it suddenly feels like this is really talking to me. It feels like there's an individual there talking individually to you. And you really get that person who wrote that or did that, okay? So all of us have seen ads on TV where you go, who makes these ads? What were they thinking? It's so ridiculous, right? And that's because you're not the target audience for those ads, right? They're targeting somebody, and that person is going to get them and go, wow, I really want that. And you're going, what was that? What were they trying to say, you know? So actually the best ads are those ads that turn some people off and turn some people on in a big way. Okay? So that initial get is very, very important, and you can only do that by being very, very targeted and being willing to sacrifice generality and sort of apple pie-ness. Okay? So you really have to be a little bit edgy on some sides, or a little bit targeted, a little bit focused, to be able to permeate that clutter and get that first bit of attention.